This is Craig and Andrew, two Ranger qualified Army officers with MBAs, here to help you improve your business through leadership.
Each week, we'll deliver easy lessons from the battlefield to the boardroom on how to improve team performance. If you're a leader or want to be, this is the place for you.
Welcome to the cohort.
Disclaimer: the views in this podcast are those of the authors alone and do not represent the views of the Department of Defense or the U.S. Army.
Hey, welcome everybody. Glad to see everybody here at the Command Post cohort.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to start with discussing, as leaders, should we explain the purpose of every task? Then we'll discuss a little bit how that applies to the business world and understanding purpose inside of a business. And then we're going to wrap things up with discussing the Army's transition from the command and control style to mission command of leadership and what that actually looks like.
That was a big change.
Yeah, so I think, when I think of leadership, one of the first things that comes to mind is explaining why we do things and the purpose of what I'm asking my team to accomplish and what the value is in that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, man. You have to convey to the employees the why, right? They have to know why. They have to know the context of what they're doing to really fully be able to understand it and make it better, really.
And I think sometimes as leaders, because we're always busy and in a hurry, and we don't want to take the time to explain the second and third order effects and how we got to this point and why we're going to move in this direction, because it does seem very time consuming at the beginning. But what I found is it saves me a lot of time when there is an emergency, because then it goes back to building that trust. If they know that I've explained why we're doing something every other time, and I walk in the room one day and say, hey, look, I need you to execute this task right now, and walk back out, they're going to trust that there's something going on and that there's a reason that I'm not giving them the purpose, and it's not any negligence on my part or because I just don't want them to know.
Yeah, so like you said, should we explain the purpose behind every task, right? I would say yes, but just like you just said, that doesn't mean you have to do it every single time, right?
Yeah.
Hey, clean up your workspace. Like that's probably not one you need to explain, right?
Yeah.
But hey, we're introducing a new payroll system.
Yeah.
So here, take the software and do that. Well, why? What's wrong with the old system? Well, this new system is faster, more efficient, more error-free. It's going to relieve you of some time. It's just you're going to have to get over this temporary learning curve to introduce it.
Yeah, those big changes, humans don't like change. And I think that's a great example of one reason that you absolutely must explain why. Because there's always going to be exception to every rule. And, I don't like to speak in absolutes, but I think when reasonable, we should explain the purpose of the task, because it's a step in the right direction of building trust. And I think that it helps our team members understand what's going on, and they can then understand how to add value to the organization and what the organization is trying to do. And that it's not a conflict between departments or a competition. Sometimes when they understand the why they're doing this, it can mitigate a lot of resistance.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It promotes buy-in, right? If they understand the why, they understand why we're introducing a new payroll system, and they're more likely to take ownership of some of that and to help accomplish it, instead of, you're right, coming back to you and asking, come back to the leader every 5 minutes asking questions and not fully executing the changeover in this example of the system. So, and I think that's a critical piece, right?
I think one thing that's always surprising to those who've not been in the military or were years ago is that when I work with companies, a lot of times I get the whole, like, you can't be yelling at people and making them do push-ups. And in the first few times that I heard that, I was kind of taken aback, like, why do you think that's what it would be like? But, at one point I was a commander of a basic training company, and so you've got that task, there with the drill sergeants and trying to help mold civilians into soldiers. And the reality is I did not want someone who only did what they were told.
Yeah.
I wanted soldiers who were critical thinkers, not just a little bit of thinking, need lots of thinking, and true problem solvers, even at the lowest level, because they bring more value to their units the more they're able to understand. And so I think that there's this misnomer out there of how the Army does things sometimes.
Yeah.
And that was one big takeaway for me is I didn't want them to just do what they're told. I wanted them to truly understand the task, no matter how basic it was or how complicated it was. I wanted the drill sergeants to take the time to explain the why behind it, because we're not always going to be there to solve the problems.
Yeah, no, no, dude, I think that's a great example because really the purpose of basic training, right, is to take somebody and introduce the baseline, right? Get them to understand the
Right.
baseline, right? And then get them to understand, how to operate initially within the intent and the why, right? And then from basic training, they go off to their units. They're more prepared to execute tasks that are given to them based off of,
Right.
it's a good point. Like that you don't want just people that say yes, right? So I was working at Fort Moore for a time, and there's actually lots of civilians in the Army. A lot of people don't know that. But where I worked, I had 3 civilians that worked directly for me, and one retired, so I had the opportunity to hire one. And I had seen this particular person working in another area as a contractor at a different time, and he was, and so I knew he was good. I knew he would be a good employee, so I hired him, and he accepted the position. And it was interesting because like the first few weeks, the first month or so, he would come up to me and ask a bunch of questions, right? Hey boss, can I go talk to Mr. Cassery, who was my boss, about this question? I was like, yeah, man, yeah, go ahead. Like we've talked about this. You have my intent, right? And hey boss, I was thinking about doing this and doing that. Well, yeah, man, yeah, like okay. And so finally it came to the point. I was like, all right, listen, man, like I didn't hire smart people so that I could do more work.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I hired you to be smart and do smart things. You have my intent. We talked about some things, and if there are some problems, you can always come up to me. But like, you're smart, make smart decisions, and let me know. And then if you're outside left and right limits, then we can adjust. But I'm not going to get mad at you for coming up with a good idea,
right?
Or
and
even a bad one.
Yeah, I always tell people, like, as a leader, you're really trying to work yourself out of a job.
Yeah,
I want
great.
to increase the skills and capabilities of my team to where I can. Now, it doesn't mean I get to go golf on a Tuesday.
Yeah,
it means that I can work on more strategic level problems. And so, as my time is freed up because my team is more empowered to do other things, I can focus on either longer range goals or maybe more strategic level. So I'm going up in echelons of what I'm able to better prepare the team for. And you mentioned left and right limits. It makes me think back to when we talked about standards. And I just, as a leader, I want to be able to give those navigational buoys. I want the left and the right, and I just want everybody to keep it in the channel in between.
Yeah.
I don't need them to come to me every 15 minutes or every day. I always want to communicate with my team, but that doesn't mean that that's me assigning them tasks or micromanaging. I'm still going to communicate with them on a regular basis, but I want them to have that freedom of maneuver to exercise those critical thinking skills and that problem solving, because I'm going to get more perspectives from my entire team than I will with just me. I don't want to be the single point of failure.
Yeah, no, that's so great, man. Because like to expand on my example a little bit, what I was doing at the time, what I was doing it for more, was kind of accounting for and changing the organization of different units in the army. So he had to account for the people and the vehicles and the weapon systems and things like that. So it became like a very much number focused type of work. So that's what these, by me hiring this person and saying, hey, I need you to count these things or whatever, uh, that allowed me to move really from being an accountant to like more like the chief financial officer, if that makes sense, right? I wasn't
Yeah.
actually dealing with money, but it was still like numbers and accounting for things. So then I could talk to other people in other units or in other divisions where I worked and say, hey, listen to them and say, hey, what are you guys thinking in the future? How is this going to affect these numbers and things like that? And can we pay for it with these sources and things like that? So then I could better picture what was going to happen in the future or how we could account for it, how we could pay for it. And then I could bring that to the team and say, hey, I need you to look at switching this for this and what the impacts are. And then they would be empowered to go and do that and come up with other solutions as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I didn't get to go golf, right?
Yeah.
It allowed me to do more and better work.
Yeah. And that is the, then that actually allows the entire team to perform better
Mm-hmm.
because you're going to go to those other departments and gather those insights so that your team can be better prepared for when that time comes or when somebody asks a question. Whereas if you were the one still, digging into the Excel sheets, you may have not been able to go and gather that
Exactly.
information for the team.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it is, leadership's a team sport. And, when we talk about how does this relate over on the business side of things and understanding purpose inside of a more traditional business outside the military, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is understanding how can I help my other departments?
Mm,
But to do that, I've got to know what their purpose is. So it's not just, that Craig may be working in sales right now and I
yeah.
understand I need to sell things to make money for the company.
Yeah.
And hopefully I understand it at a deeper level. But if I only understand it there, I also need to understand, the purpose of my logistics team, of the manufacturing,
Yeah.
of marketing, because the more I understand how all these pieces fit together, as a leader, I may be able to prevent friction points and problems before they actually uh, arise and become a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing I thought about and we talked about in my MBA classes is like, and you just touched on it some, which is if I am in charge of the manufacturing department for pieces of this one piece of furniture, right? I'm just in charge of building the bits, the pieces. This other division is in charge of putting together. This other division is in charge of shipping it out. And this other division is in charge of selling it, right? To the stores or whatever. I can increase my output building the parts. I can increase my or decrease my costs in my division. I can increase my division's value, right? Based off of my metrics by using cheaper parts or changing the steps around to make it easier, faster to produce the different shelves or whatever, right? Using different, cheaper perhaps materials, right? So that might make my manufacturing division faster and more within
Right.
certain metrics. But then what's going to happen when it gets to the assembling directorate or division,
Yeah.
right? They're going to start putting everything together and the parts are going to break,
Right.
or it's going to break apart in shipping, or it's going to get sold and a customer is going to buy it and it falls apart in the house within a month,
Yeah. So
right?
second and third order effects.
Exactly. So if I understand all of those things as the leader of the manufacturing division, I'm better able to say or better able to articulate, hey, we our costs are this much so that we have good materials to produce the pieces that are going to be manufactured and shipped and sold,
Right.
right? So it's not just understanding my own why, right, my own what, but the enterprise's
Mm-hmm.
why, right, and how I fit into the other parts of the business.
Yeah, because it's easy sometimes. A lot of leaders are competitive, and I
Mm-hmm.
think healthy competition's good. But I don't want to make decisions for my department, in that
Yes.
example, manufacturing, and maybe I know that the general manager's, really cost driven. And so I'm trying to prove that I'm the best by
Yeah.
cutting all these costs. But then the reality is does the entire organization suffer? Because for
Yeah.
my small victory of, yes, I saved the most money this year, this quarter, but now we have unhappy customers because I chose to go with an inferior part that is now costing everybody. And
Hmm.
so if I don't understand second and third order effects and what's really going on throughout the organization, it does affect
Yeah.
everybody, not just me. But then in turn, if the business is not successful and has to close, now I'm also out of a job. So
Right. And
so
so,
it
like,
does, it
yeah,
comes full circle.
and that's the why, right?
Yeah.
Like, what? Why am I manufacturing these bits, these pieces? Well, so that ultimately we can provide a good piece of furniture to an owner, right? To a customer, right? It's not. I'm not building this piece just so that I can save the company money. It's more than that, right? So now, if I understand really the why, now I can the intent. I'm better able to work within that, right?
Yeah. And I think, we've spoken in the past before about like with automotive brands, you
Mm,
brought up that you have to understand how every product, uh, inside your organization may have a different purpose. Because that's
yeah.
also something. It's not just that I have to understand my task, but I also need to understand uh, what function is, or what solution is this product providing.
Mm,
I always think back to, I've heard, and I would give credit if I can remember who said it, but nobody buys a half-inch drill bit because they want one. They want a half-inch hole in the wall, but they can't buy that. So in terms, they have to go and buy a half-inch drill bit. Well, that's, if
mm,
that's your department selling drill bits, you need to understand that's really what somebody wants. They didn't actually want your drill bit. They wanted a hole in the
yeah.
wall.
That's a great example.
But that's hard to put on a shelf. And so that's one of the things I think of is like, as we, try to relate this stuff back to business, because it's all principle based in my eyes.
Yeah.
Everything that, I feel like all my lessons learned in the military translate over, because you got to keep them at the principle based level. It's not that I'm going to turn around and go to a manufacturing company and train somebody on marksmanship, but I can train them on attention to detail and
Yeah.
understanding the purpose.
Yeah. That's you're exactly right, man. Yeah. The principle conveys, right?
Right.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And this is not, somebody that you just bring in, right? This is not to take the place of training, right? You still have to
Right.
train the person on how to operate the system or the machine. But once you do that, once you achieve that, then they can operate within an intent,
Yeah.
right?
And so I'll give a quick example from basic training that we used in marksmanship, since I mentioned that, is for immediate action on a rifle. So if you're at the range and you're shooting at your targets and it stops working, you're pulling the trigger and it's not firing. The Army has a little acronym called SPORTS, which stands for slap on the bottom of the magazine, pull the charging handle, observe, into the chamber, release, tap the forward assist, and then squeeze the trigger. Some people joke that it should actually be sport ass, because you should aim first before you squeeze the
Mm.
trigger.
Eh,
I think it's valuable. But the that's what, soldiers are trained. They've only been in the Army for a couple of weeks, and marksmanship's one of the first things we do. But we want to be very deliberate in the training and understand why we do each of those steps,
yeah.
because each of those steps serves a purpose, and they are trying to correct basically the, like, you know top 3 or 4 malfunctions that are the most common that happen
Yeah.
on a rifle. I don't want these soldiers to just do that because they were told to do sports. I want them to understand what's going on with their problem, because we talked about that critical thinking and problem solving. So there's a malfunction on a rifle. Everybody calls it a stovepipe. Basically, the casing doesn't eject all the way, and on the side of the rifle you have a 1.5 inch piece of brass sticking out the side. It's very clear and obvious if you know what you're looking at. I mean, it's is probably the most obvious weapon malfunction, in my opinion, that I can think of right now. But sometimes we would have soldiers who would have that, and the first thing they do is slap the bottom of the magazine. Well, slapping the bottom of the magazine has zero effect on that stovepipe. And what you actually have to do is pull the charging handle, and that clears it. And so what we were trying to explain is if you understand, you can see the problem, do what fixes the problem. Because they also knew, because you could ask them the questions. These are intelligent people. They understood that slapping the bottom of the magazine was just muscle memory because that's what they'd been doing during training. And so this is those times like maybe we should reevaluate our training and not make it muscle memory and put it more on the thinking side of things, because they could identify that piece of brass hanging out, pull the charging handle, and you're back in it. And so that's one thing that I always think of with things like this is I want them to think through it and not just, it's not a checklist. A lot of times I always tell people like leadership's not a checklist. You can't just go down through there checking off the boxes. You got to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Leadership's not a checklist. That's good. I didn't think about that, man. But so like you said, a few years ago, the Army transitioned from what was called command and control to mission command. So command and control really kind of in its simplest forms, if you boil it down to a very simple example, there are steps to put a radio into operation. And, really kind of pre-war on terror, you had to follow these specific steps in order, or you would not pass the test. Right. And like it was screwing in the microphone before you screw in the antenna. And so that's command and control, right? Very orderly checklist. Do this, then that, then this, then that. And so you can extrapolate that to how the Army taught how to do operations and things like that. Mission command is, hey, did you put the radio into operation? Like, does it work? Yes. Okay, good. Then you're good. It's not, did you put the antenna on first and then the microphone? Oh, you did it backwards. No. No, it's like, does that really matter? I mean,
right.
You need to put the antenna on. You need to screw in the microphone. So which order you do those, does that really matter? Or did you get the radio into operation? And that's kind of the very simple explanation of the difference of those two things.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting for us because I feel like we came into the Army in that transition time frame. Command and control was really designed to fight a near peer. It was designed, to take on another nation state and have large divisions and brigades maneuvering on the battlefield, and it was all about fighting where you knew there was an enemy and what type of enemy was there.
Yeah.
And then
how many? Their echelon.
Right. Like all this, and that goes back to that checklist. Because I remember as a young lieutenant, trying to memorize, vehicle identification, max range of a weapon system for these different potential threats. And, when war on terrorism started, we quickly realized that's not how terrorists operate.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get a tank brigade and drive across the desert. They operate in small cells that they really operate based off intent and their purpose, and they don't have a checklist. They're just out there freelancing.
Yeah.
And so the Army kind of had to adapt to that. And I think I felt like a little bit playing some catch up of, okay, we see this doesn't work as well, so we've got to make some adjustments. And so you start going into, coach would just give, this is my intent. This is what I'm trying to achieve. And you get those left and right hand limits. And then you have that freedom to figure it out. And so it went everything from, it changed how we operated and to put a radio into service, because now I no longer am worried about, do I do the mic or the antenna first? I just need to make sure the radio works and it meets the intent. But it also affected how I went about planning my patrols and my operations and what was expected of me as a young leader, because there was no hand holding. It was, I need you to go find the bad guys. So go find the bad guys. There was not a lot of like, this is how you're going to do it. It was like, hey, they're in this area. Maybe. Yeah. Maybe not.
Yeah. So that brings to mind an example. So fast forward a few years in the war on terror, we got towards where we're starting to close down Afghanistan and close down different bases, smaller bases, as we build up to closing down the larger ones. So I was in charge. We were operating in eastern Afghanistan, and I was in charge of 3 different platoons, right? And at one point, the my boss came to me and said, "Hey, I need you to send a platoon out to this other base to help close it down." And I was like, "Okay. When do they need to leave?" It's like, "As soon as possible." Oh,
Yeah.
well,
It's
great.
exciting.
So then I had to go back to my platoons, and I said, picked one of my platoon leaders and said, "Hey, you know, you're gonna have to go to this base and link up with these people and help close it down." And that's literally all I had. That's all of the information that I had. Now, I had been working with this lieutenant and it was this platoon and in this area for quite a while now. So we had that trust, right? I knew that he would understand my intent, right? I did not have the time or the information to explain to him every single what if, right? What if we get into a firefight? What if I hit an IED? What if we need trailers? I didn't have time or the knowledge to do all that, but we had the trust between each other, right? I trusted him, he trusted me, that I would do everything I could to help him, and he would operate. I could trust that he would do everything he could do to execute the intent, right? So I gave him the radio channel for the point of contact on the other end and gave him the name of the base to head to, and there he went
Yeah.
off with his platoon. And we continued to work as we went through it to solve all those problems,
Yeah.
but I couldn't answer every single what if, so he had to operate based off of intent.
Yeah. And I think that's a good example of like what that trust does. It takes some time to get to that level, but
Mm,
as I think, your team and your uh, those that you lead understand as you go when you're doing those small things like explaining why we're doing something,
mm,
setting standards, enforcing them, taking care of your team. I think that all those little things add up to build that trust to where you need to just walk in and not explain and say, "Hey, look, here's the deal. You got to go and here's your left and right limits. Let me know what you need and I'll help you out." Because they know that you're going to be there to support them. And I think all of this, explaining why and giving people the purpose and intent goes a long way in building that trust.
yeah, in that example, the why was the immediate intent, right? Was to help close down this base, but the overall intent, the why, was to get the United States Army out of Afghanistan, right? So it was important to say, hey, I'm sending you and your soldiers into harm's way uh, to help close down this base, pull out all his equipment, help get those soldiers out of there, so that ultimately we can get out of Afghanistan, right? That was all kind of, I mean, that was almost understood at that point because that was kind of changing phases in the war. But the immediate intent was go help close down this base. But it linked pretty easily to the strategic level, which may not
And
happen in your manufacturing division. But you can take that principle, right? Understand the why that we're providing quality furniture to the customer. Hey, I need you to buy these parts and not the others because they fall apart too easily. Well, why? Well, because ultimately we're providing quality furniture to the customer.
right. And I think that's a good example there. I'm glad you mentioned like at that point everybody already understood that
Mm,
the goal was to exit from Afghanistan eventually, and that was. But I think back as I imagine you had a lot of those conversations with your lieutenants in more of an unofficial capacity. It's not
yeah.
like you have to explain this purpose as a order or as a tasking. In your general communication and conversation, a lot of times you're explaining second and third order effects as you
Mm,
go. And
mm,
that stuff builds upon itself. And so then you can, not only does it build the trust, it builds the overall understanding of the situation, whether that's a
yeah.
manufacturing situation, because I mean, just think of like, we're only a few years removed from the pandemic to where we had, drastic changes in the market conditions of every industry in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And so little things like that, like as people communicate things and understand why, why does a shipping container cost 10 times more than it did, 3 weeks ago? Well, the market has shifted. But explaining those things doesn't always have to be like a formal training session. It happens a lot of just through daily communication. And that goes back to, we started this with, hey, communication's important. You got to talk to your people.
Yeah, yeah. And that builds trust over time. I think you're absolutely right, man. So if listeners, if you haven't read Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, I highly recommend it.
Absolutely.
He does a much better job than I am explaining a lot of these points and why the why is so important. It really, really resonated with me, and I think it will with you as you're listening to this podcast.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great recommendation there.
He's very articulate and he's got a lot of great examples, but it's important. You have to understand the intent, why you're doing something, to really do it properly and more effectively.
All right. Well, we appreciate everybody listening and look forward to talking more about leadership in the future.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in.
Y'all have a good one.
As always, take these lessons, use them, and spread them. Everyone is welcome in the cohort.
Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe for more, and drop us a line at commandpostcohort.com to request a specific topic.
We'll see you next time on the cohort.